in order to solve. The first method that you should be looking for before anything else is what? Yeah, which is a factoring method. So you should be looking to factor it. This always comes first. In order to factor, remember we have to be set equal to 0. I already heard one of the factoring methods, GCF. What's another one? AC. It's not a factoring method, but I liked where you're going with that. That'll come up later. What's the last factoring method? It's the one that everybody forgets to do. No, that comes later. So all of the ones you're giving me right now are solving methods, which is perfect because you remember your solving methods. Difference of squares. Difference of squares, if you're going to forget one, is probably the better one to forget because you can solve it by square root method. You don't have to solve it this way. Okay, so difference of squares. All right. If these don't work, so that's where you should start. If they don't work, then you have two separate choices. And we're going to write these choices, tilt this up a little bit. You're going to write these choices side by side. So your first option, if it doesn't work, is method number 2. And that is the square root method. How do I know I can do a square root method? Yeah, you only have an x squared in the equation. In other words, it's ax squared plus c. You don't have that x present. If you have an x present, you cannot do square root method. Square root method would be like 4x squared equals 5. In order to run it, you have to get the square alone before you try to square root. That was a common error on the quiz. You were square rooting before the x squared was by itself. How do I get x squared alone here? Yep. Divide by 4. And then what do I do? Square root both sides. Number one mistake on problem number 1 of your quiz, you didn't throw down the plus or minus sign. This would give you plus or minus the square root of 5, because I cannot take it, over 2. Questions there? All right, 3. If you can't do square root method, if it's not set up for square root method, then you have the options of quadratic formula. Quadratic formula follows the ax squared plus bx plus c. And you have that formula, x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. If you don't want to do that, the other option you have is complete the square. So like I said, what we're going to do right now is we are going to go through every single problem on your quiz. I don't care at this point if you want to redo it in pen, just to keep it separate. If you want to redo it in pencil, just because it's for your own reference. You're not submitting these back into me. I already have your grades up there, and they're all set. Okay? But I am expecting you, if you miss these problems, to go through it and to correct it. Because if you have not taken a retest for me before, you should know that the retest is pretty much the exact same thing, set up the exact same way, they just change the numbers. So you should be studying this worksheet between now and Monday so that you can score a much better score on Monday. All right. What I ask is if you scored a 4, that you take a little break right now. You don't answer any of my questions that I'm about to ask. I also would ask is if you got one of the problems right that we were going over, same thing. Because again, I want to prove to you that you know more than what you allowed yourself to believe yesterday. You might have had a couple of mistakes. You might have had a couple of things that tripped you up, which is fine. Okay? But I believe that you know more than what you were doing. So, in other words, I want to hear from people I don't normally hear from. Okay? I want you talking to me, and I don't want to hear one person. I don't want to hear 2 people. I want to hear all of you talking, taking control of your education, and getting this correct so we can fix this. Okay? Number 1. Number 1 tells you what method to do. It tells you to do this by square root method. How do I begin?
Subtracting 5 over 4.
Good. Subtract the 5 from both sides. Because it's a positive 5, we have to subtract it to make it 0. That cancels out. I'm left with 3x squared is equal to 36. At this point, this is where I would say half of you went wrong. Because you square rooted right here. You cannot square root right here. If you square root right here, you have to square root that whole side. Can you square root 3? No. So I can't square root that side. Which means I need to get rid of 3. How do I get rid of 3? Good. That gives me x squared equals 12. At this point, what can I do? Square root. Don't forget your plus or minus sign. Some of you guys missed a half a point because you didn't do the plus or minus. All right, now, I can't stop here. What do I have to do from here? Huh? I have to do the factor tree. So I'm looking at 12. What multiplies to make 12? 6.
3.
What was the point of doing the factor tree?
Find a pair.
Find a pair. What is my pair?
2.
I got a pair of 2s. Now, don't write this. Number 1 mistake besides the mistake up here is writing it like this. That 2 does not go in front of the plus or minus sign. That 2 has to multiply with your square root. If you throw it in front, you've changed it to an adding and subtracting with the square root. So when you pull the 2 out, that 2 has to go in between the plus or minus sign and the square root, because this is plus or minus the square root. 2 was part of that square root. Are we good to there? Are there questions to there? Remembering that if you say no, you're telling me that on Monday you would get it.
Would there be any scenario where you would put the 2 in front of the plus or minus?
Not on this setup, no. You'll see that happen on, I think it's number 2, where you'll see a number go in front. But if that happened, you added or subtracted something to move it over. But not from the factor tree. You will never do a factor tree and end up in front. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, number 2. X squared minus 12x plus 4 equals 0. This one told you you had to do completing the square. Some of you guys tried to do quadratic and messed up in the quadratic. Regardless, you need to do completing the square on it. How do I do that? Where do I start? Yeah,
You have 12?
you can, but before you do that, so you're actually on step 2.
You gotta make it 0. You gotta subtract 0, don't you?
Subtract what? You're on the right track with it. Somebody help them out with it. Subtract the 4. So we need to get rid of the 4 because it doesn't work for me. What you should think about with completing the square is you need that plus blank in the back, and the 4 is in the way. So we're going to subtract the 4 so that I can do the plus blanks in the back. From there, Sunny's completely correct. We half the 12. So I have negative 12 divided by 2 gives me what?
-6.
If I square that, what do I get?
36.
That number is what goes in to both of the blanks. Good so far? All right, from here, you could choose to factor that AC method, or you can use our little trick. If you use our little trick, what is in your parentheses squared?
X minus 6.
Yeah, because that number before you square is always that number right there. Equals -4 plus the 36. Good so far? All right. Now I have a square. How do I get rid of the square? Square rooted. That gives me x minus 6 is equal to, don't forget your plus or minus sign. Every single time you have a square root, you got to check it with your tree. So you should be coming off to the side. What multiplies to make 32? 16?
4 and 4.
If you notice your pairs there, you could stop. Otherwise, you'd keep going. I have 2 pairs of 2s. So,
Just do 4.
on the outside, you get a 2 times 2, which is 4. Again, if you notice the pair here, you could have stopped and brought out the 4. Regardless of the way you do it, you should have gotten plus or minus 4 root 32. Or sorry, 4 root 2, because that's my loner. Good so far? All right, now I need to get x alone. How do I get x alone? There is no way I can add 6 to this chunk. I don't know what the square root of 2 is. I just can't do it. The 6 needs to go in front, and then that plus or minus goes in the back. That's the only time you'll get a number in front of the square root, or the plus or minus, I should say. What I find interesting is some of us got to here on number 2 and we still missed number 1 because of the plus or minus sign. We remembered the plus or minus here, but not on the front. That is a testing rush. So once you're done going through and finishing problem number 5, go back and double check it. Because like I said, if you have the plus or minus here, then you know it goes there. Go back and check it before you turn it in. Some of you guys turned it in and you had like 20 minutes to spare. Go back and check. Okay? Questions here? So we feel like we could do it? Number 3, you have 2 options. I will not be checking factoring because it says it's complex, meaning I get an imaginary from it. So your choices are complete the square or quadratic. I think most of you tried quadratic, so that's the way that we'll go just to get another look at it. Otherwise, you could have done complete the square on this. If you want to do quadratic, you have to be equal to 0. So how do I fix it? That gives me negative x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. Now, I told you that you don't have to have the front be positive for quadratic formula. However, if you don't fix it, you're going to have to fix the chunky answer, which becomes a little weird. So my recommendation to you, anytime you have a negative in front, is once again to divide out a -1. When we divide each of these by -1, you change all of their signs. 0 just ends up being 0. This will not factor. Nothing multiplies to make 5, adds to make 4. So I'm going to go to quadratic. What is my A? B?
-4.
C.
5.
Plugging it in, I get x equals what?
4.
4. Notice they changed it to a positive because I took a negative of a negative. Plus or minus square root.
-4 squared. Minus 4. A1. 5.
Good. All over.
2. 1.
A lot of you guys can get to here. That's not the problem. The problem is the simplifying it. There's a lot of little pieces. Take it slow. We need to take care of this square root first by doing our order of operations. What is -4 squared?
16.
That is always positive. Every single time. You will never have a negative here because you are squaring. So this should always be positive. It's the sign in the back that changes. And it changes depending on what this multiplies out to, what sign you get when you multiply this. So if I have a -4 times 1 times 5, I get a -20. Be careful there. If you're going to make a mistake, that typically is where it happens. What is 16 minus the 20? Some of you got to here. You recognize that the negative gives you an I, and then you did not square root the 4. What is the square root of 4? Sorry. So I get 4 plus or minus 2I, because that 4 was negative, all over 2. The 2, the 4, and the 2 reduce by 2, and that gives me my final answer of 2 plus or minus 1I, which is just I. Questions on 3? Yes,
So how exactly do you get an imaginary number?
the negative inside.
Okay.
So the moment you see a negative, you have an I on the outside. If it was like square root of -5, that would be I times root 5.
Oh, okay.
Okay? If I can actually square root it, like the 4, then you get the square root of that with the I.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions with it? Alright. Number 4. Number 4 even tells you that it factors. How should you be looking to factor this? Yeah, GCF should be first. I don't have anything. And then I heard the other one, AC. So the question becomes, how do I run AC method on this? 7 times the -3 gives me what multiplies to give me a -21, but if I add, I get a -20. Now, a common error. Remember, when you set up the fractions, you need to bring the A down with both fractions. Put the -21 and the +1 underneath. 7 and 1 does not reduce, but 7 and 21 does. Reduce them by 7, and I get 1 and a -3. That gives me x minus 3, 7x plus 1. I would say half of you factored it beautifully, and then you forgot what it was asking you for. What was it asking me for? To solve it, which means what do I do from here?
X minus 3 equals
And then
7x plus 1 equals
add 3 to both sides, I get x equals 3. Subtract 1 gives me a -1, divide by 7 gives me -1/7. Questions on 4? Let's go to 5. Number 5 asks you to find the zeros. What does that mean? Set them equal to 0. You should have replaced that h with a 0 to solve. All right, so from here, what method of solving? Square root. Good. So what do I do for that? Subtract 50 from both sides. And then? I can reduce the 50 and the 16 by, bless you, 2. That gives me 25 over 8. Negative over negative is a positive. Good so far? From here, what do I do? Square root both sides. Square root of 25 gives me 5. I can't square root 8. And this is where it gets a little weird. Like I said, my key was wrong on this because it was missing a small piece of it. But I need to look to break down that square root sign. So 8 breaks down to what? 4 breaks down to what? I have a pair of 2's. So what does that become?
2 square root 2.
You are not allowed to have a square root in the bottom. So what do? Multiply top and bottom by the square root of 2. That gives me 5 square root 2 over, you have this 2 that I haven't touched. Root 2 times root 2 gives me another 2. So my final answer is 5 root 2 over 4. My key had 5/4, although I don't think anybody got to here. If you got to here, let me know. Because like I said, my key had 5/4, not 5 root 2 over 4. Okay? This one is a little tricky because of that square root simplification. But again, the disappointing thing to me here, I didn't see this very often, where we plugged in that 0 and tried to solve from there. Does that make sense on number 5? Yeah.
I got something.
Does that give you what? A 5? It gave you a 5? Okay, so then you would be excused from the retake Monday. Just bring a book.
So we were wrong with that decimal.
Yes. Yeah, because my keys are in fractions always. It's always better to have the exact number.
Why isn't it 5 plus or minus square root 2?
Oh, sorry. You should have plus or minus in front. Thank you. But remember, it goes in the front of the 5. Because you never added, you were multiplying here, you never added with the 5. You're multiplying with the 5. So if you do 5 plus or minus root 2, then you're telling me you're adding with it. If I do plus or minus 5 root 2, I'm telling you you're subtracting it, but we're taking either the positive or negative result. Questions there? How many of us looking through that feel like we're good? Like Monday, we could retest it, 4 or 5. Was I right? Kind of let it intimidate you? You knew more than what you probably thought you did going into it? Okay. Don't let them intimidate you. Don't let you look at one problem and let it snowball. Okay. The first thing that we're going to do, we will not have time to grade the assignment.